You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from thecinematropolis.com. And today's topic is The Main Man, parts 1 and 2. Speaking of parts 1 and 2, Joshua, hey, this is a serious question. I know the 90s was a decade when different things were in, but seriously, was Lobo actually popular enough in 1996 to warrant a full 2-part episode?
1,000%. He absolutely was, and it's wild. Let me tell you a little bit about it.
Oh, go on, because I like things about the 90s. I even like things about the less flattering parts of the 90s, like leather-clad heroes or bad boys. But yeah. Lobo, there's not enough real meat on the bone of this character for me to rationalize how they gave him a 2-part episode.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So let me get into his history a little bit, and I will illustrate that you are not alone in that to a certain extent. So, much to some of our surprise, Lobo was originally introduced in 1983, and he was created by Keith Giffen, was the writer that created him, and Keith Giffen is a funny guy, and he will tell you right now that he initially created Lobo to be a send-up of characters like Wolverine and the Punisher. And remember, this is 1983, okay? So, Wolverine had not had any of his rough edges shaved off yet at all. He was absolutely the little murderous, like, Lancer, the contrarian of the X-Men in 1983. And the Punisher had nothing to redeem him yet. Like, he was just full bore, Chuck Bronson, Death Wish guy with a big skull on his chest. And Keith Giffen thought that was dumb and funny, and he made Lobo to make fun of it. You may know Keith Giffen, maybe not. I mean, I know you're not as much of a comic book guy as myself, but you may know of Keith Giffen from the time that he and his creative partner, J.M. DeMatteis, worked on what is 100% called the Bwahaha era of the Justice League. Are you familiar with this at all?
I'll confess, Joshua. I mean, you're probably about to describe what this was, and I will probably recognize it, but I did not know it had a name. So I'm not familiar with it by name. The Bwahaha, you say.
Yeah, so this would be like mid to late 80s, post-Crisis. We've talked about Crisis of Infinite Earths before. This is an era in the Justice League when I'm not going to tell you that they didn't have really serious stories, because they really did, but they would also just make jokes. Like, this is an era when it was a huge deal that Guy Gardner, the Green Lantern at the time, would not shut up, and so Batman punched him out. Like, that's, that kind. And when one of the characters comes in to discover the aftermath of the scene, everybody is literally bwaha-hawing. That's one of the things. There's so many gut laughs for you, the reader, that are also being mirrored as gut laughs for the characters, that's why it becomes the Bwahaha era. Booster Gold and Blue Beetle were very much like the odd couple getting into scrapes and shenanigans. It was a good time. But this is the guy who gave us Lobo, okay? And what's fascinating to me about Lobo is he creates him in 1983 to be a send-up of those really violent characters. But it's satire. And the thing is, Lobo's in on the joke to a certain extent. So the fact that he became very important, like actually very popular in the 90s, is funny to me because he only went deeper into the satire. And this started in 1990 with his own 4-issue miniseries, Lobo the Last Zarnian, plotted by Giffen, but written by Alan Grant with art by Simon Bisley. Simon Bisley's art is just fantastic. You almost certainly don't know the name, but if I showed you some of his art, you would go, I have seen this before. That kind of thing.
So, Joshua, I just have to say, I find it very appropriate, very fitting that, of course, Lobo started as a satirical character. And I do think he maintains that from my experience with the character largely.
Yes.
But it's funny how he's utilized sometimes. It's like it's almost like he's kind of like Deadpool, but like maybe the writers using him don't always know he's like Deadpool. I don't know. It's because I've seen him used in ways that make you think that they don't realize he's a joke, but also he's clearly a joke.
Lobo is almost always used as a satire, if not actually a full joke, okay? And sometimes it does stray directly into joke territory. And it is not dissimilar from how Deadpool actually became a character anybody cared about. You're not wrong. Deadpool's a little more meta, a little more genre savvy, whereas Lobo is just like unrepentantly the character that he is. And then you plop him down into situations where that character is a spanner in the works or just a big shock to everyone else. Like I mentioned, Last Zarnian is basically there to retcon his origin to make him even more of a satire. That's where they introduced the fact that he killed everyone else on his planet for a high school science fair project.
Yeah, that was great. I loved it.
But then you go from that to Lobocop, which is a RoboCop parody, and RoboCop is almost a parody of the 80s itself, so that's fantastic.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that, because RoboCop is often misread as serious when it is very much definitely a satire. And anyone who's familiar with Paul Verhoeven, it's wild. So I just think it's really great that it is two layers of parody. It is a parody of a thing that is parodying the 90s violence, or the violence we saw in our action movies in the late 80s, early 90s. And I just think it's listen, we live in a time where there's a whole lot of anti-heroes that a lot of people, I guess, specifically probably men, don't realize are anti-heroes and celebrate their bad works. So I find Lobo to be in that sort of way.
Almost never in actuality. I will put your mind at ease. Almost never in actual practice is that the way the character is used. And I'll give you an example of some of his other personal specials, like that was just him on his own. The paramilitary Christmas special, where he is contracted by the Easter Bunny to assassinate Santa Claus.
That's good.
They did a convention special that's actually a send-up of comic book conventions. They did Un-American Gladiators, where Lobo is part of a deadly televised game show. He even had his own series for 64 issues, which I really feel only worked because he was also appearing in Justice League at the time. He kind of made a big splash in Justice League, but mainly in a book called Legion and its spin-off Rebels. And what's fascinating about that is that Legion is a police book in some ways. It is a descendant of Superman's enemy Brainiac, who is trying to start an intergalactic police force, the Legion, right? And in order to get the muscle he needs, he tricks Lobo into swearing to do what he says. It's a trick. But that's where he gets the muscle for Legion. So you have this like really like spit shine, button up your coat, do your cop stuff, where Lobo is the reason that they can get things done. So that's what I mean by him as the spoiler. He is almost always treated not necessarily as a joke, but as a problem. That he is a means to an end, but we're also going to make a lot of messes along the way, which I think we're actually going to see more of as he appears in the DCAU. So that's good news.
Yeah. Joshua, thanks for giving me that thorough breakdown. And I just want to reiterate, I genuinely like Lobo in this episode. I think he's really, really funny. I think he gets some great one-liners. Sometimes I cringed a little bit because it feels so 90s, but now the more I think about it, the more I actually think it's funny, because it's, like you're saying, it's so cringe it's supposed to be funny. Like, it's obviously very cringe. So even in the 90s it was cringe. So it's supposed to be so bad you're going to laugh at what the character's doing. And I also really like where else they use him in future. They don't use him a ton, but when they do use him in the DCAU in future episodes, I think maybe one or two more times in Superman and once in Justice League, he's a hoot. He's really funny. So overall, I actually really appreciate you providing context, because at least when I was initially watching this, I didn't know 100% how seriously I was supposed to take him. Obviously, he's being funny and kind of a satire, but to what awareness were they utilizing the character was what I was questioning. And it sounds like, from what you're telling me here, that they were in on the joke just as much as we're in on the joke. So I can rest at ease knowing that, because he was really funny in this episode.
I think you can absolutely rest at ease. What happened to Lobo that I find absolutely fascinating is that so much of the worst or even middling examples of superhero comics in the 90s were basically doing Lobo, only not as a joke, which actually, I think, ties into why he caught on so much in the 90s, because those of us that were starting to realize that this was a little bit of a creative bankrupt era in a lot of ways, and that some of those choices were thematic, like the emphasis on lots of military, lots of guns, lots of anti-heroes in our superhero comics, is why when you had a character like that show up and just be a complete friggin' buffoon, while also being taken seriously. If I'm making it sound like it's a very difficult tightrope, it is, and Giffen and DeMatteis are excellent at it. They are good at it. Not everybody is good at it, and you had a bunch of people who not only weren't good at it, but didn't realize that it was satire and did it for real. And that caught on, and it's kind of a terrible time for superhero comics, real talk.
Well, it reminds me a lot of the McFarlane stuff, which I everyone's allotted their opinion.
McFarlane is a fine example of someone who did not understand that this was a joke. You're absolutely right. He's such a bro.
Right. And I mean, I know there's a lot of Spawn fans out there. I don't know if I would count myself as one of them, but like comics like that, where you're utilizing anti-heroes in such a way, or the Punisher, another character that I feel like has been used. His use has been all over the board, and I can't speak to how he was used in the 90s, but it's just a character when you read it, you're like, okay, this guy is clearly really bad, and I can't tell if the writer also thinks he's really bad, or if the writer thinks, yeah, go get him, or even like some of the Frank Miller stuff from the era. So
no, you're beautiful. You are a beautiful man for bringing this up, because I have said this before specifically about Batman stuff, right? That you had Alan Moore on Watchmen and Frank Miller on Batman Year One and Dark Knight Returns, who did very grim and gritty. Well, now this is a separate conversation. Watchmen is not a superhero story, but a lot of people treat it like it is.
Yes.
Which is a problem. But Alan Moore sure as hell wasn't treating it like a superhero story. Nope. But you have this very dark, grim, gritty take that two very talented writers worked very hard to make work. And then the problem was, for a big chunk of the 80s, was you had a bunch of people show up who thought it would be easy and instead just did it badly. Now, you can actually project Lobo into the 90s in that way. He was a satire, but you had a bunch of people not realizing that he was a satire and instead treating that archetype like it was serious and worthy of attention. And that's how we got the original flavor of Deadpool that now nobody thinks about. That's how we got Big Guns and Cable. It's how we got all kinds of not great stuff, right? So you're absolutely right. You have somebody show up and do a thing really well, and then you have a bunch of other people show up and do it nowhere near as well. And in this case, that part of that not doing it well is not realizing that it was satire in the first place. I think this is actually a problem that I have with some more popular nerd properties now. There are claims that some shows or movies are satire, but they're so close to the thing that they're satirizing, you can't tell. And I don't think that's Lobo's problem, but I think that you got some, honestly, less talented people, less talented writers who didn't make the connection and gave us a lot of dross in the process.
Yes, I am 100% with you all the way on everything you just said. So I think you and I are on the same page. I think about, here's an easy example, right? This is my opinion, and I don't want to get in the weeds of it, but it is very possible for you to create a character that is obviously satirical, who is obviously not a character that you're supposed to like celebrate, you're supposed to like be in on the joke on, that is often misinterpreted. We see this a lot with like Rick and Morty, for example, which the show has since course corrected because they realized that, oh my gosh, we're writing a character that's obviously a bad person, but certain parts of the audience aren't, like, they're relating with him more than they are critiquing him or like being in on the joke. So then you have people writing over Szechuan sauce, and then the writers who were very good at what they do are like, oh no, we have to fix this now because we didn't make it clear enough, I guess. And they've done a really good job in this new season that just aired on television. That's one example. And it's comic books, it's pop culture. And you and I have talked at length about this, Joshua. Rorschach, frankly, is another character that was written as a parody of an archetype that a lot of people clearly didn't get the memo on. And I just think it's really good that we're having this conversation, because my concern watching this wasn't like, I thought it was funny, but I was also like, did the writers mean to do this? Or was this the joke? Or is this another case of like people not understanding what they were putting out there? So you kind of like giving me this history is actually very helpful for me, because I really, knowing this, I really enjoyed this episode a lot more than I did on the viewing.
No, that's huge. I think that's the biggest deal. I think you've nailed for me why it's important for critics to be able to bring that kind of perspective. This is not to pat myself on the back, but just to use the example of something like Fight Club is another fine example that just keeps getting confused. Like, no, it's making commentary on toxic masculinity, not celebrating it. But if you're going to show up and just be all about the toxic masculinity, you're going to miss that and think it's a manifesto, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but when you come to the work knowing that it was satire on purpose, like you know what to expect from this piece or this character, it should enhance the enjoyment of that story or that character. And hearing you, who is a seasoned critic, be like, I'm really not sure if I should be enjoying this as much as I am, that is a reasonable response. It's a response that people should have to the stories, especially that they're taking in, because you need to interrogate that stuff, you know? And some of that is realizing when it's satire, and some of it is calling creators to task when they create something that they claim is satire, but you can't tell. Right. Then it's bad satire, and you need to go back to the drawing board, because instead it's going to be used for this other thing, you know? I've got a couple of fine examples. Rick and Morty's a great poll. But I think, this is the job of actual criticism. And even if you're not a professional critic, if you're watching something and you're like, I am really not sure if I should enjoy this in this way, that's a good feeling. Chase it down and do the research.
Yeah, do the research and I just think this is a really good conversation to have about anti-heroes in general, because it seems like, it's often easy to feel like, oh, well, this is a new problem, Joshua. But you giving me this whole backstory reminds me that, yes, this is a thing we're seeing a lot of today, but also clearly it was a thing we were seeing in the 90s and even in the 80s to a certain extent. So it's not a new problem. And it really makes me just think even more about how when anti-heroes are utilized, we've got to be really careful with how they're utilized, because the wrong lesson can be learned or taken from people when things aren't made very, very clear. But at the same time,
I don't want to put all that on the artist, because it's okay for an artist to leave some room for ambiguity and for thinking. But there's a lot of things where that's not what they did. They just didn't do good satire. Like, that's the conversation, right? Like, is this bad satire, or is it actually supporting the thing that the creator claims it's satirizing? And honestly, what the creator says is not the final arbiter of that. We are, and the conversation that we have around it is.
100%. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that, again, I think just to reiterate too, they need to be very clear, but at the same time, as all artists making art, there needs to be a certain degree of ambiguity. And I just think it's a very, like, again, it's a very fine line you're walking. And I think if you're utilizing an anti-hero, you probably have something you want to say about something, and you want to make it clear what you're trying to say while also leaving enough ambiguity for people to be able to talk about it. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it puts a lot on us, the audience, to know how to talk about these things. And that's hard. That's hard sometimes.
And I think we can actually see some of this roll out in this very episode. Okay, so I'm gonna jump around our notes just a little bit, and I'm gonna talk about the BIMBots.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh, I forgot about. I didn't even think about noting the BIMBots. Go ahead, please do elaborate.
This is an example, in my opinion, of where this episode missteps, okay? When it comes to the satire of Lobo. Because I do think that the creators on this show very much understand what Lobo was supposed to be doing in the comics and did do, okay? When does it go too far? The BIMBots. Here's what I mean by that. Aesthetically, they make a lot of sense with Lobo. Like, he is very much like a road warrior, punk kind of guy, and they have a very punk aesthetic. And we can also tell that Lobo, in a age-appropriate manner for this show, right, for the audience of the show, is a drinker, womanizer, that kind of character. They keep it largely age-appropriate, but we can see that in there. So again, the BIMBots make sense from a certain perspective. However, We have discussed before that these are creators who do not do the best job with female representation or woman representation or just generally not being sexist. They just don't have the best track record. And the bimbots are where I feel like the Lobo satire steps over because they're beautiful robot women with all that might entail. I know we're trying to keep this clean, right? So I'm dancing around what that suggests about Lobo's relationship with women. And then he breaks them, like he shatters them into pieces. And the way that they become inhuman when they use the gas on him strays towards the area of mature adult themed toys. Okay? Yeah. I don't want to say anything else because we try and keep it clean on this show. But that's a place where I feel like they really take Lobo just a step too far, right? Like everything makes sense until you kind of take one step and you look at the whole and you're like, whoa, that's a little much. And I think that that's also part of this conversation we should be having. Lobo as satire completely works. Some of the trappings that get attached to Lobo do not.
Yeah. Okay, here's another example that I think non-related to this, not comic book, but I think has the same problem is you look at the Austin Powers movies, for examples, right? The way they use fembots are pretty terrible. like they're still objectified and made to look very pleasing to the male viewers, and that's kind of gross. I think you're seeing the same sort of implementation here. It's just not very thought through. But it's a visual gag that is funny visually, but like it still doesn't really critique the thing it's doing. It's just doing the thing because it's visually a funny thing. I think in the year 2020 that feels a lot grosser than it did in 1996. I'll just put it that way. So
it definitely stands out to me in a way that I don't know that it did in 1996. So that's very fair. We do have a few other characters to talk about, and honestly, that may have been the bulk of this episode's conversation, because I think a thing you and I can both agree on is that these are really fun episodes, but they're not meaty. The discussion about Lobo as satire, when he works and when he doesn't, is honestly more meaty than anything that goes on in these episodes, which is okay, because they're still very funny and very action-packed and an enjoyable watch, but they aren't big ideas.
Right. No, they're not huge ideas. Because here's the way I broke this down, Joshua, and you can let me know if you disagree. This is a 2-part episode. Part 1 is literally like one fight. Yeah, there's a bookend. There's bookends where they're not fighting. But like, I would say of the 22-minute runtime, you're looking at least 14 minutes where it's just Superman and Lobo flying around beating the crap out of each other. Either in Metropolis or in space, where they're kind of like stopping every now and then to like have some banter, kind of similar to a Dragon Ball Z episode in that way.
Oh, it is. That's very good. Yes.
So that's part 1. Part 2 is a totally different type of story. It's a prison break episode where there's not a lot of thought put into the actual prison break. It's more about just the fact that you have these two very different characters bouncing off of each other, and it's fun. It's
an odd couple story, much more than a prison break story. It's just the prison break is how we got the odd couple together, I think that's probably why the second episode is a lot more entertaining overall. Like I like the fight scene, but the second episode is clearly the better of these two episodes.
Yeah, and I think again, like the way they lay out's pretty fun. I really thought it was funny. I feel like could it have been better? Maybe, but I do like the idea that okay. All right, in the bookend for part 1, we introduce these bounty hunters who are at odds with Lobo. We're going to bring them back in part 2. They're going to show up halfway through part 2 to add chaos to an already kind of chaotic situation. So I thought that was really fun. A really nice touch too. And I thought the designs for all of those bounty hunters was really fun too. In fact, the main one of the main ones we have here, the Squeak and Nah.
Yes.
I don't know, something about the eyes within the eyes actually makes my skin crawl, which again,
it's very creepy.
It's creepy, but it's also used comedically, so great design choice there. But yeah, I love all of that. I love this is the part of the 90s that I find especially endearing. The bounty hunters grouping together to like these big honcho bounty hunters trying to go do a thing, and they do it very unsuccessfully. Generally speaking, I just found that all to be really fun to watch, and to see, again, to your point, how Lobo makes a fool of them pretty much the whole time is great.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I actually think all of the alien designs in these two episodes were very good. Like, some of the animals are a little lazier, like the kind of rhinoceros monster that Superman uses in the second episode. But all of the sentient beings look really good. Or at least I should say they're doing exactly the thing that they ought to be doing, because one of them does not look good at all, and that's Emperor Spooge. Ooh, gross.
Oh, yeah, what is up with that? Oh, man. I can't, I think that, okay, you know what? No, I'm just going to say it, Joshua. That's lazy. Drawing a giant poop monster that has a mouth is not in any, it's never creative. Not even with the poop emoji, which is the most creative version of this design, but it's poop with that talks.
So I think that they're doing a Jabba the Hutt nod. So I'm fine with it from that perspective, but he really is just absolutely disgusting, because he's not only a giant poop monster, he's a giant poop monster that's covered in like slugs or maggots or something. Like, he's super gross.
I need to take a shower just thinking about him.
Right, yeah. But the Preserver, on the other hand, has two forms, and I am a big fan of both of them, honestly.
Yeah, yes. So I want to be clarified. It was funny, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole too much, because I'm sure it's in the conversation, but I kept when I was writing my notes for this, I kept putting the Collector and being like, no. That is the Marvel version of this premise.
Right.
The Preserver, who is collecting all of the rare specimens from around the galaxy. Yeah, I love both of these designs. In fact, I thought the transformation between the two of them was especially eerie. Like, I felt like it was almost out of a Cronenberg movie or something. Like, it's really, really great work on both versions and the transition.
I really like the fact that the physical threat version of the Preserver is just a Clayface reskinned.
Huh. Hadn't thought about that, but you're right.
Go look at him again. He is definitely Clayface that they added some claws and nodules onto and changed to red. It's great. I have no problem with this. I noticed that, and then also noticed that in that hangar, one of the spaceships is just a gold painted Batwing. So, which again, I don't care. You're fine. But I like that it's a reskin Clayface. They're reusing some stuff, but he looks really different than Clayface. And I don't mind telling you, this is kind of a fun one, is that some of the people that used to work on this show went on to be part of a creative collective called Man of Action that created a show I've mentioned before, Ben 10. My son loves Ben 10.
Yeah.
One of the aliens that Ben is able to turn into is definitely inspired by the Preserver, who was inspired by Clayface. It's kind of wild.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I think we've pointed this out before. And I'm sure one of the benefits of doing a Batman redesign was they were able to share a lot of the same assets and core designs. And I didn't even notice. But again, while sometimes it's kind of lazy, I think here you point out a really great way to get bang for your buck in like some core designs, because it means the core design is very strong, that you can change it in such a way that it's almost not recognizable, but still have that same kind of core features, I guess.
There's no reason to reinvent the wheel if you have a good design laying around that you can tweak into something else, right? Like, we understand this is commercial art. The commercial part enters into it. Money matters. We don't want to make it not look good. Well, hey, why don't we just recolor Clayface and reuse and add a few things to him? Perfect, right? It's great.
Yeah, no, 100%. Joshua, I guess I don't have a ton more to say on this particular episode outside of a few just random notes, because I got to the point where I was like writing stuff down.
No, I think that's the right way to handle it. Tell me, I do have one other design that I want to make sure we talk about, because he shows up twice as a cameo, and I do think that this is these creators, one, throwing us an Easter egg, but also going, we're just going to put this here in case we need him later. Not once but twice do we see Starro the Conqueror in the collection of the Preserver.
Very nice.
And Starro the Conqueror is a starfish from space that can take over your mind. He is literally the reason the Justice League initially came together in the comic books, and I love him, even though he's absolutely ridiculous. And I loved him when he was ridiculous, and I loved him even more during Grant Morrison's run on JLA, when he not only made him significantly more threatening, but actually turned it into like a Twilight Zone style, who can you trust? Who's under the control of Starro's story. It's just for a spaceborne starfish, he's got a lot of layers.
Joshua, I'm glad you noted this, because one of my random notes was, if this episode was written in 2020, the Preserver's ship is the perfect place to sprinkle in all sorts of Easter eggs.
It really is, yeah.
Like I think about how I think it was in Thor 2 when they go into like Odin's vault and you see all this stuff and you're like, oh my gosh, this is that thing and this is that thing and oh my gosh, are they going to use that thing? And oh, here's also there's the Infinity Gauntlet, things like that. And I think I'm glad you point out Starro because they do that with Starro, which I won't spoil it, but they will use this character again later and reference this episode in a different show like that doesn't air for like 5 or 6 years. So kudos. I don't know if they had actually planned to do that or if it was like one of those, we're going to throw Starro in there. We might use him again someday. But either way,
I think it's probably that one. I think it's that one which shows you the power of restraint in your creativity, because instead of throwing everything at the wall, you're like, we're going to put one thing here because I bet we need it eventually.
It also kind of makes you wonder if there's like, again, I always find this interesting when writers do stuff like this. If there's like, they had some like cork board in their writer's room where they're like, loose ends we can pull from at any point, and Starro was up there somewhere, and they're like, and then again, like 5 years later, they're like, Starro, we never used him. He'd be a great fit for this episode. It's just,
yeah.
But again, I think that just ties into something you and I have talked a lot about, which is that especially once we get to this phase of the DCAU and like how it's rolling out, they're doing things like this where they're planting a lot of seeds. And I don't know, some of the seeds may be more intentional than others, but this is a thing they do that we will see followed up on in various series that come after this. And I think it's just really good storytelling and good world building it's good world building that does not sacrifice the story for the world building. Because when it comes back later and they explain the connection, you're like, oh yeah, hadn't even thought about that, but that's a cool way to tie these two series together in a way that makes good chronological sense, thematic sense, and like it just all fits together. It seems it's probably not planned the way it is, but the way they execute it feels like it was, and that's just really good storytelling.
Yes, I agree. It's the best way to use that stuff. I have kind of one big complaint about this episode, or about some stuff. Let's call it the detritus of world building, because this is an unintended consequence that I think that winds up being kind of bad for Superman. Tell me what you think. I understand how we wound up with Superman in a spacesuit and flying a rocket that shoots lasers. I understand how we got there. I mentioned when we first started this that depowering him after Crisis was a big deal, right? And so he couldn't survive unaided in space anymore, right? I understand how we got here, but it's bad. Like, it's terrible for Superman to be flying a spaceship that shoots lasers. It's just bad. And it made me long for the days when he could just, live in space. We do get back there, by the way, once we get to Justice League. But here, I'm just watching it and I'm just like, this is supposed to be a Superman cartoon, and instead it's kind of like bad Star Wars. What is this?
Yeah, so I also noted that was a weird sequence. I love depowered Superman, but maybe they could have not had this sequence, and maybe they could have had him not fight in space the way they did, because it just is weird. Like, see, I already find Superman in a spacesuit just visually to be kind of strange.
Yes.
But yes, firing the lasers, it doesn't feel Superman in pretty much any capacity. So I think they could have written it out or found a more clever way to have a space battle. I don't know, but yeah, not a fan of that sequence myself either.
But now I'm out of things to complain about, and I think you had a few positive things you wanted to point out. So what do you got?
Well, firstly, I love any shout out to the dodo bird that we can get, because I said,
right?
Hey, that's kind of a clever nod. Oh, hey, there was this species that became extinct, but the collector, gosh dang it, doing it again. The preserver has one in his collection, maybe two, who knows? But at least one. Thought that was a nice touch. I loved. Firstly, there was the banter between Lois and Clark, where Clark actually makes a joke about being Superman to steal the byline, which I found hilarious, because he just laid it out. He's like, "Yeah, I am actually Superman. I go around, and I do all this so I can get the best headlines and steal them right under your feet." Which is actually true, and it's hilarious that she doesn't.
Well, and he presents it in the way that it was originally presented, like in the comics and on the radio, which was, I work in a newsroom so that I will know about disasters as they happen.
Right.
So I appreciate that they put it that way, because he then gets to kind of throw and get the byline thing on as a dig, because I do think that there is a conversation to be had about Clark Kent's journalistic ethics but I don't want to have it in the Lobo episode.
Oh, no, not at all. But yeah, that was funny. Yeah, I like that. I also loved, because of how they utilized Lobo and kind of in spirit with all the stuff you'd already talked about being the episode, he's so wildly out of place. I kind of love how he's a master of chaos. Like,
yeah,
no one really knows what to make of him. Even Superman, he blows through Lex's office and Lex is like, what the devil? Like, it just, all of it was so funny. And just because he feels like he's so out of a different type of story that
Absolutely.
When he is dropped in this, it's almost like a fish out of water, and it was used really effectively here. So I thought that was a nice touch. And lastly, fun fact, and I have not seen this, but apparently they launched a Lobo web series in the 90s, which I think is crazy, that was designed to be for adults. So he was allowed to like swear and be more violent and all that stuff. I don't think I really want to watch that series, but it does exist. That this was intended to be a pilot of sorts to reintroduce Lobo to the mainstream for this web series.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that couldn't work, especially now. Like, imagine a hard satire of anti-heroes done on like the DC Universe platform, which is kind of one of the things that Harley Quinn is doing, honestly. But you could do it so much harder with Lobo because he has been treated this way for so long. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm unsurprised that it didn't go the distance back in the day, though.
Yeah, I mean, it had like a run of episodes. I think I don't have the full list in front of it. I think it was more than 5 episodes. I mean, and they were like shorts, kind of like, again, like a short YouTube series before there was YouTube.
Yeah,
Again,
no, they did that with the female characters from New Batman Adventures. Also, they had a Gotham Sirens series that was like, let's see if this works, but nobody was really online in that way when they were doing that.
Well,
so
imagine trying to watch videos in 1996, 1990, before 2000, have to sit there for like 20 minutes to let the first 5 minutes of the thing load. I'm sure it was not great, but one last thing I want to bring up, and I have mixed feelings about it, but I did like, as a conclusion to the episode, we see Superman further establishing the Fortress of Solitude as we would come to know it. I prefer to read it as a safe haven for these creatures that he had taken from the Preserver. I know there's the whole captivity angle, which is certainly worth talking about, but I think that it was intended to be as he has taken all these creatures that have nowhere to go and brought them back to the Fortress of Solitude to have a new home and a new life. And I thought that was a sweet moment.
It is a sweet moment. And I want to say there is some confusion for me about where this episode goes, because a lot of it feels like it should be before Brainiac. Like him testing the spaceship and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And I liked the just vague introduction of the fortress as a thing that might come to fruition in Brainiac. But this is a huge step towards showing me like the kind of Superman I want to see. Because yes, there is a conversation to be had about animals in zoos. But we also have to remember that every single thing in the Preserver ship is the literal last of its kind, which means there aren't 2 dodos and there aren't 2 rhino things. And what are you going to do? Put them out where they can well, first of all, a lot of these are alien creatures. Where are you going to put them? But even something like the dodo, what are you going to do? Put it out there to get hit by a predator? Like, it deserves, by the nature of its existence as the final of its type, it deserves to have like a soft, cushy lifestyle on the way out, I think. I'm certain that there are animal rights people who might disagree with me, and I would be interested in having that conversation with them more about the other alien creatures more than the dodo, because who the heck knows what kind of habitat they needed to be left in,
Right.
But yeah, I love that bit at the end. It's very, very good.
Yeah. I thought it was a nice way to wrap up the episode. Again, like you said, it puts us back in that position where we feel like, hey, this is a lot closer to the Superman we want to see, or we've been thinking we'd see. So yeah, nice touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Caleb, if people enjoy these 2 episodes, as we did, what other alternate media might you recommend to them?
Okay, so Joshua, I'm just going to put this under the preface that my initial reaction to this episode wasn't that I hated it. I liked it. I had fun with it, but I was not as impressed with Lobo as a character. But now after talking about it, I feel a little differently. But these recommendations are with the original in mind. So If you want more, what I found to be a very enjoyable version of a 90s-tastic leather-clad bad boy, I am, and probably always will be a fan of 1998's Blade.
Yeah, you should be. Everybody should be.
That's a great movie. I mean, the special effects have not aged well in any capacity, but man, I love Wesley Snipes in that role. I love it. I love the characters. I think it is 90s-tastic, but that's just who Blade is, and they run with it, and they commit to it, and it's got vampires. And really, in a lot of ways, I think it was one of those movies that's a part of the conversation that changed the perception of vampires in pop culture. Unfortunately, we ended up with Twilight in there somewhere, but they basically started changing the rules or the ways vampires were used on the big screen. So I thought that was a good one. And then the other is actually a very influential anime film that also features the appeal of motorcycles, games, and quick quips, while also showing how dangerous and unappealing it can also be. And that is 1988's Akira. It is a very influential, very respected work of anime. It is definitely more on the dramatic side, more so than Lobo, but I really, really like it a lot. And I think, there's certain things about it haven't aged well, but I think some of the core messages about, Japan and where that country ended up even 40 or 50 years after the bomb dropped, still has a lot of meaning and weight to it. And it's got cool dudes and motorcycles riding them around. And anti-heroes that have been questionably interpreted by the pop culture sense. But hey, it's a great movie. Highly recommend it, and I highly recommend you either watch it subtitled or with the more recent dub from 2001, because there are multiple dubs. So those would be my recommendations. Joshua, how about you?
I am going to be pretty on the nose with this one, and I'm going to admit it's because I've been rereading this bit of Superman comics, but it really feels on point to me. I have been rereading the New 52 reboot of Action Comics. It's written by Grant Morrison, so you already know I'm in the tank for it. And I would recommend the first arc for anyone who really liked these two episodes. It's collected into a volume called Men of Steel. It is very much a Superman Year One story, like a young, brash, t-shirt and jeans kind of Superman who is slowly, over the course of the story, introduced to a much wider universe. And it actually culminates in him having to deal with Brainiac. In a way, it's more character on point with stolen memories, but the move from relatively inexperienced Superman to, oh no, not only is the universe much bigger, but some of it wants to collect me, is very on point for Men of Steel, and I could not recommend it more. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, I'm the editor-in-chief and contributor at a website called The Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis, and we publish in-depth essays on all types of films. You can find those articles as well as our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, over at thecinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about the new Batman Adventures episode, Growing Pains.
Until next time, look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's an animated discussion.